Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Today I'll be discussing the issue of mass incarceration and the First Step Act prison reform. Although the American public has remained normalized to the subtle changes in the rate of incarceration during the last few decades, the country has begun to reach a concerning spike that can no longer be ignored. The U.S. penal population of 2.2 million, about the population of New Mexico, adults is by far the largest in the world. Not only is there a concern about the growing prison population, but about the disproportionate number that is made up of African Americans due to their history of receiving the heaviest mandatory minimum penalties for drug crimes. Punishment and punitive policies are two of the things that have controlled the prison population. During 1971, when the war on drugs first started, sentencing guidelines and policies began adjusting to keep up with the usage of drugs in high crime rate neighborhoods. An example of an enactment that was a direct result of the war on drugs was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which allowed mandatory minimum sentencing and more punitive measures. Not only this, but during the 1980s, three-strike laws and truth in sentencing laws were also implemented as a strategy to make drug crime sentences more severe. These laws lengthened sentencing for drug offenses and made it mandatory to serve a higher percentage of the time criminals were being sentenced to. These laws enacted have failed to protect individuals from unjust and biased treatment. These mandatory minimum sentences strip judges of the ability to tailor the sentences given to offenders according to the crime that was being committed. In one specific case, Gary Ewig, who was convicted of stealing golf clubs that amounted to 1,200, was subject to the harsh punishment of a 25 years to life sentence because the crime seemed serious enough. Faulty sentencing laws are what contribute to the rising incarceration rate and wrongful punishments such as in this case. In 2014, Congress began funding the Charles Colson Task Force on Federal Corrections, which consisted of criminal justice practitioners, lawmakers, and other experts with experience in federal and state prisons. They created policy recommendations that were made to lessen the cost and reduce the size of the federal prison system. This task force also ran a year-long fact-finding study to determine the leading causes of the prison population increase. Through the study, it was revealed that long drug sentences, driven by mandatory minimum penalties, were largely responsible for the growth of the federal prison population and its associated harms. In order to begin tackling the issue of mass incarceration, the United States should begin to focus their attention on shortening sentencing length and refining prison rehabilitation. Although there are an abundance of issues remaining within our prison systems, our government is currently working towards creating prison reform. An example of this prison reform is the First Step Act, which was first signed into law in 2018 to reduce sentencing lengths and improve prison rehabilitation. The automatic components of this reform essentially work to provide people with the additional chances to avoid mandatory minimum penalties that allow a judge to impose a sentence lower than the statutory minimum in some cases. The reform gives judges greater discretion to sentence someone below a drug mandatory minimum penalty, based on criminal history. The First Step Act also works to expand recidivism reduction programming, as well as to improve conditions of confinement for inmates. The Act also works to help individuals in transporting to an institution closer to the release residence because of the implementation of a reward and incentive system. After completing risk assessments, this will motivate individuals to complete and participate in evidence-based programming in order to gain a resentence and possibly get transported. Now, through the enactment of this reform, those in federal prison because of crack cocaine offenses that took place before 2010 are now allowed to apply for resentencing to a shorter prison term. According to the Justice Department, as of May of 2018, roughly 3,000 people serving outdated sentences for crack cocaine offenses have been granted with the resentence for shorter prison terms. The reform has played a huge role in representing a decrease in incarceration. Only after 1 year of the First Step Act being signed, the federal prison population was around 5,000 people smaller, continuing several years of declines. It has also continually shrunk throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, punishment should be reasonable in comparison to the crimes being committed. The United States has already unjustly sentenced offenders because of faulty sentencing laws. After observing and analyzing the history of sentencing and the alarming rise in the prison population, it is crucial to continue establishing and implementing alternative practices and policies to continue truly tackling these issues.